Howdy y'all, it is I, the Diabolic vTutor yet again. But today we're going to be, or not today, right now we're going to be doing something a little different. The usual topic is mathematics, but today, right now, we're going to be covering some English basic grammar. What we're going to cover is what is a sentence, and then we're going to do something called subject-verb agreement, or rather a number agreement in terms of grammar. So let's get started with that. This is the idea is this is going to be some help for people who are going to be taking standardized tests. For example, if they're taking the SATs, and by SATs I don't mean the one that is the big SAT. I mean some sort of silly ass test. So SATs, not affiliated with anything else. So again, with the SAT, some sort of standardized test, some sort of silly ass test that someone's making you take, and you need to cover grammar. Well, we're going to be talking about that right now. So when I begin talking about sentences, I'd like to talk about the verbs. And just to preface this entire discussion, what I believe may or may not be endorsed by other people. This is just my general approach. The way I try to understand grammar, because grammar is just rules, and then rules are fake because people just make up rules to try to model the real world situation, which may or may not agree with the rules we try to force upon it. So there's that. And just as a little bit of history, I've stumbled across things online. In particular, I remember reading up on Wikipedia about sentence structures. I think the classical understanding of sentences, I'm not entirely sure. I'm not a historian, nor am I some sort of linguist or even a real what are those called? Person knowing grammar, right? Again, this is just from what I've gleaned from the internet and what I've been teaching people, if they wanted to listen. So I remember reading up on the Wikipedias about sentence structure, and then the classical idea is basically subject, verb, predicate, subject, predicate, I think. And I honestly, this never really agreed with what I like. When I read about it, it sounded really convoluted. So rather than adopt that approach, I'm going to adopt one of the approaches expressed in Wikipedia. I don't know if it's still written there in the article about basic sentences, but I am going to focus on the verbs when talking about sentences, and then the verb is basically like a mathematical function in a certain way. But let's be careful though. I think math is a type of language, and of course all languages have some sort of rules that we've constructed, and English language is no different. This is English language from the perspective of SAE. This is basically silly ass English. It's not exactly worldwide. It's dominated in particular in North America, for example. So if you're learning British English, I'm sorry, this ain't gonna help you. Maybe. But anyway, we're talking about verbs, we're talking about sentence structures. When I like to talk about sentences, I talk about, again, going back to verbs. And verbs basically have some arguments, or in other words, things that you can put onto your verb depending on what the verb type is. Some verbs you have to put something in the front, and then some verbs you have to put something in the front and something in the back. And when I mean front and back, I mean from left to right, traditional Western style reading from left to right. So this would be, from that perspective, that would be the front, and then this would be the back. So to the left of the verb is the front, and then to the right of the verb is the back. So some verbs are like this, and then some verbs you have to put only something, you only need to put something in the front, and then some verbs require front and back. But I already said that, right? Okay, so to talk about that, verb types, I am in agreement with the people who say there are like 3 main verb types. So there's a transitive verb. There is the intransitive verb. So if you're familiar with this prefix, that's just simply a negation. And then there is the linking verb. Maybe I'm using old vernacular at this point, but those are the ones that I learned and then the ones that made sense to me. So hopefully they'll make sense to you. Okay, so when we're talking about all this type of stuff, what are we talking about? So when we're talking about transitive verb, that is basically the verb type. Here's a verb, and then the verb requires something to the left, and then it requires something to the right. And what this verb does is basically there is some sort of transfer of action. So you see the word trans? Trans means to cross over, and you've seen this word before. You've seen it in transform. When something is crossing forms, it's changing from one form into another form. You've seen it in the word transport. So when you are moving something from one ship port and then you bring it over to another ship port, that's called transport. So there is a transfer of something. So in this case, when we're talking about transitive verb, there is a transfer of something ambiguous. So here's an example. So you can say that I hit the wall. Wait, that's I don't like that. I hit the wall. I hit the object. I hit the box. Yeah, there you go. So I hit the box. So in this situation, we have a verb type right here. Again, that's called this is an example of a transitive verb. There is something to the left of the verb, that's I, and then there is something to the right of the verb, that is the box. So there is a transfer of action in this particular situation. So it begins with I as a function of the verb. So the verb is hit. So from what we understand what hit means, from what you've learned throughout your life, the box is basically receiving the action. Okay? So again, there is a sort of something called the subject. It's typically in the left-hand space of the verb by most sentence constructions, especially when people are talking in real life. So there's a difference between the written word and the spoken word. When people are speaking, they tend to always put the subject first for all the verbs. So for example, if someone is feeling particularly peckish, they would say, I am hungry. Although it is correct to say hungry am I, nobody says it like that. Why not? Well, I think people like to say the subject first because that focuses on what someone is talking about most immediately. So, yeah, I think that's the reason why. But, am I right? Who knows? Anyway, we're talking about the verb hit. The hit is an example of a transitive verb because there's a transfer of action. There is a sort of a doer of the action. I basically need to activate my muscles using ATV and stuff, and then I have to swing, and then there's some sort of impact. What is being impacted? The box is being impacted. So that's the idea behind I hit the box. So transitive verb, there's some sort of transfer of action or there's some sort of recipient of the action. And then when you learn this one by most conventions, including the one that I like to adopt, I is referred to as the subject, so S for subject. And then there's some sort of verb, that is in this situation a transitive verb, and then there's some sort of thing receiving the action, and by conventions, most conventions, that's called the object. So subject, verb, object for transitive verbs specifically. So again, there's a verb, there's something to the left, and then there's something to the right. And the doer of the action, or the one who's transferring the action, is always to the left of the verb. You never have a switcheroo type of situation. So this is why statement order is important, because the first noun for a transitive verb, the first spoken one and the first written one, is always the doer of the action. So So if you said, I hit the box, it is distinct from saying the box hit me. And you might notice it changed from I to me, but more on that later. So you would not say the box hit me. It doesn't have the same meaning as I hit the box. Well, I guess you could say the box hit me. Because maybe the box fell from some higher up location and then it smacked me on the head. In that case, it would be the box hit me, but that would alter the entire meaning of the sentence because the original sentence was, I'm supposed to hit the box. So SVO. Alright, moving on. So that is the transitive verb. Again, there's a transfer of action. There's a doer of the action, and then there's some sort of typically a recipient for the action, and the order is important. And then the next verb we have is the intransitive verb. Well, if transitive is the act, there's some sort of transfer of something within the action, then intransitive is simply the negation of that. So there is no transfer of action. So in these situations, you have verbs that are complete in and of themselves and require no argument afterwards. And by argument, again, I mean like a mathematical function input. So for this thing, for these type of verbs, it only requires something to the left, and you don't need anything to the right. So once you have that, once you fill out this little box here, then it is, by my standards, a complete sentence. I don't like to go with such ambiguous definitions like, oh, a sentence is an idea that expresses a sentence is a construction that expresses a complete idea, which I don't know how useful that is for you. And again, just a disclaimer, I'm not exactly a linguist. I'm not exactly I shouldn't even say that. I'm not a linguist at all, but just a casual person who enjoys language. Very casual. Alright, going back to this, of course, again, the intransitive verb is a verb that you only are required to fill out the one in the front. And like any sort of computer program, you have to put something here. And that's all you are required to do. You aren't required to put anything anywhere else. And if there are any form situations, then you have to change the form. But more on that later. So, for example, you can say that I sang. Ooh, actually, this verb is a little tricky, so let's avoid this verb for now. I waited. Alright, so that's a better verb to illustrate the intransitive situation. So when you say I waited, this one is quote-unquote complete in and of itself. And again, the reason being, if we understand the usage of this waited, and this is through common use, what you have observed throughout your lifetime, this one only requires something in the front. Again, this is how do we know if something is transitive versus intransitive? It's typically what you've associated, what you've picked out throughout your lifetime, and you begin to internally build up rules in your head, like, okay, this verb only needs something in the front, or this verb needs something in the front and something to follow it to express complete action, or going back to the other idea, a complete idea, quote unquote. All right. So when I say this is a intransitive verb, I'm just basically telling you that by convention, by most usages, by dictionary usage. More on that. More on my opinion on dictionaries later, maybe. Anyway, from what is commonly accepted and by most people of the population, waited is an intransitive verb. You don't really need to. You don't waited something unless you're a waiter. So, which leads to another complicated idea, right? So in this situation, the wait verb is intransitive. It's intransitive because I'm telling you it is intransitive, so maybe that feels like exercise in authority of tautology, but that's what I'm trying to say. This is a verb. You only need something to the left. You don't need anything to the right. And that idea, that construction, once you've completed that construction, then this is a quote-unquote complete idea. All right? So that is the intransitive verb, and then going to the linking verb. The linking verb is basically an equality statement for the most part. I like to think about it as an equal sign. So stemming from mathematics, if you have y on one side and then you have x on the other side and you say it's equal to, then we are saying this is, for all intents and purposes, the same as this one. So linking verb is just the equal sign. So you can say I am a person. So this statement is ultimately saying thing number one is equal to thing number two, a person. And that's it. In this situation, this is a noun, and then this is a noun. This is a person, place, or thing. This is a thing, and this is a thing. We can go over a few more examples for that one. So you can say here on an I and old, you can say I equals old. In this case, this is a thing. This is not a thing. This is a description for a thing. So when you have this particular construction, you are saying that thing number one has the quality of thing number two for the linking verb. So I am old. And you're equating this one. You're not. These aren't. Both of these things aren't. Both of these things aren't things. Well, this is gonna be a noun type of word, although this is gonna be an adjectival type of word. So when we have a linking verb between those, again, we're just saying some sort of quality statement about thing number one. Now here's an interesting thing about linking verbs. You can actually switch the orders, as I mentioned before. So you can say old am I. Nobody really talks like this except maybe some long-eared green people in some sort of sci-fi universe, maybe. But people, for the most part, don't express their ideas like this. In fact, when again, going back to the spoken words, people almost always say the subject first. So I, and then verb, and then old. That's the primary way that people speak. Again, probably for conventional purposes, because it's more useful if people understand the subject of the topic of which you're talking about. They want to get that first, so and then they process the rest of them typically in that fashion. So, especially in real-time situations. So, for example, if there is a dangerous tiger that springs out and attacks someone, well, what do you want to say? You could say that the tiger is attacking. You wouldn't say attacking is a tiger, because again, the focus, you're trying to shift people's eyeballs directly to the threat, which is going to be the tiger. So you would open up the sentence with the subject first, rather than opening up with the what's happening, attacking is a tiger. So that's my hypothesis about why that is. But spoken language seems biased towards subjective always first. So in review, transitive verbs are basically verbs that take in two arguments. They take in argument number one to the left and then argument number two to the right. So as long as you fill that out properly, quote unquote, then this would be a complete sentence. So I carried the box. So this one, if you switch the arguments, it creates a different meaning. So if you say the box carried me, again, the I changes to me. More on that another time. So in this situation, the meaning has been altered. Now I am being carried by the box instead of the box being carried by me. So sentence meaning is altered if you swap argument number one with argument number two. So you shouldn't do that unless your intention is to deliberately confuse people. Alright. So there it is. And then intransitive verbs, in order to make a complete sentence construction with intransitive verbs, all you need to have is is to fill out the argument in front of the verb, following typical rules, and then you put the period, and then you are done. You've successfully constructed a sentence using an intransitive verb. So, for example, I fell. You don't need anything afterwards. If you put something after the fell, then you're changing the verb. The verb is also used to chop down trees, for example. I felled the tree. Don't we love English for this very reason? Okay, but if you just simply say I fell, this is a complete sentence construction according to the idea of functions and filling out arguments for this intransitive verb function. You just need one argument. And the argument is I. That's basically the quote-unquote doer of the verb. We're done with that intransitive idea. And then with the linking verb, all you need to do is you need two arguments always, and the linking verb is, for all intents and purposes, roughly equivalent to an equal sign. So thing number 2 is either fully identical to thing number 1 is either fully identical to thing number 2, in that they're both nouns, or the thing number 1 has qualities expressed in thing number 2. And the ordering can be swapped. Right? So if you say 1 equals 2, 1 is 2. This is not math, this is English, right? So we're going to say 1 is 2, or you could say 2 is 1. That's an object, not numerical quantities, okay? So you could do this whole switcheroo with linking verbs. So as long as you follow these rules, then you should have a complete sentence. And everything else is just, in essence, some sort of dressing. You have to follow other micro rules, but that's enough to generate a sentence, in my opinion. So let's go over some examples of transitive verbs. Here are 5 of them. I already wrote down, I've already written hit, I've already written carry, because you have to hit something, or you have to carry a thing, you have to wrap a thing, you have to consider, a thing has to be considered. Choose, you have to choose a thing. You can't just say, I choose, period. I think most people would argue that you have to have something after this verb. So you need something before the verb, and then you need something after the verb. The thing to the right, in the argument in the right, is chosen by the thing to the left, which is I. So transitive verb. So here is argument number 1, and then here's argument number 2. A has to wrap B. B has to be wrapped by something. Something has to do the action of wrapping. And I don't mean like spitting hot bars. I'm saying the physical act of enveloping an object inside wrapping paper, for example. So B has to be wrapped by A. Or in this case, A is the doer of the wrapping action, and then B is the recipient, so there is a transfer of an action. There is a transfer of an action. Consideration, so if you consider something. So something has to do the considering, and it's always the thing to the left. Again, so you consider a thing, the options. The options have to be considered by someone, or maybe an AI or something, right? So you are doing the considering. So again, this is a quote-unquote transfer of action. There's some sort of doer of the action, and then there's sort of recipient of the action. Now this is, again, the transitive verb. Intransitive verb examples, you could say complain. You can say chat. Chats. And then we have fall. I use that one, I think. There's wait. And there's sigh. Again, most people would agree that all you need to do is have something in the front. So they complain all the time, for example. So they complain, period. And this one, all you need to have is an argument. Insert something into the argument. So they complain, period. This is a complete sentence because we're following basic construction for intransitive verbs. All you need to do is have something to the left, and it's complete. It fell. Again, you fill the argument to the left, you can put a period, and then this is complete as a sentence. chats. So we have something in the front, that's chat, that's you, and then there is the verb chats. And this is, most people would agree, at least I think they would agree, this is simply a complete sentence. There is a doer of the action, again the subject, and then there's a verb. This is an intransitive verb, so this is a complete sentence following construction. It might not be very useful as a sentence, but it is a sentence by that criteria of fulfilling arguments. And then wait. Hachiko waits. The dog, the poor old dog. So we have, I don't know how to spell Hachiko. Hachiko? Hachiko? The good old doggo. Good old boy. Hachiko waits. Period. So in this situation, you have the doer, the argument, the doer of the action, and then you have the verb, and then this sentence is quote-unquote complete, because again, this is an intransitive verb by most accounts, so you need something to the left only. Sigh. I sigh every day. Again, you notice I didn't write every day. More on that a little later. But you need an argument. Fulfill the argument, that's I, and then you have the verb, it's done. Alright? Pretty nice. But of course, real life is messier than this. If we try to, like I said, what I believe before, we try to impose rules on the world as best as we can, which is useful. I'm not saying it's not useful. It is useful, but from what I believe, the world doesn't operate off our rules. It's just rules we try to come up with so that we can make sense of things, but they may or may not actually exist, and you know, we just like to make things up. But verbs oftentimes are mixed, especially depending on context, and then definitely words evolve over time, and verbs are not an exception to this evolution over time. Especially in the age of the internet, people have, and this is neither a good thing nor a bad thing, but people use words to fit whatever situations they want, and sometimes people even stretch words to do other things that people who wrote the dictionary would be saying, no, you shouldn't be able to do that. Don't do that. We have to keep our language as uniform, as rigid as possible, because otherwise it'll become something different altogether. But evolution cannot be stopped, just like in biology. It's ever relentless, and trying to stop it would be a futile exercise, a futile fight. Anyway, again, verbs can be either intransitive or transitive depending on context, and it's actually very hard to force a verb to become one thing, because again, not everyone agrees to what you think a word does. And that's why things fall in things go into style, and then things fall out of style. So here's an example of carry. So you could say, I carry a thing. I carry the bag. So again, this is a transitive verb. You have something to the left doing the action, you have something to the right receiving the action. This is a subject-verb-object construction. Pretty nice. Look at that notation, SVO. That's the notation that I will use as I go over grammar. So I carry the bag, right? But now carried has been co-opted to mean something else. So now people say, I carried the team. In particular, a gaming context. I carried the team. So the meaning of this one, we have the verb here, and then you have the subject, the doer, who carried, I carried, what was carried, the team was carried, because they are awful players, right? So I carried the team, and of course, in spoken language, oftentimes you have a lot of deletions. People just randomly omit things. Well, not randomly, it's not random, but people choose to delete things from spoken language or even typed language because time is of the essence. You can't just simply write full messages following standard American English, SAE, silly ass English, you don't have people typing full sentences for the most part because time is of the essence. If you need to say someone is sniping from across the map, you don't say, oh, there is a person in the tower to the southeast who is firing off rounds into our teammates. You wouldn't say that. So you would shorten things to make sure that your message is delivered in a timely fashion and it's received in a timely fashion and is interpreted in a timely fashion. And human brains are very powerful. They can automatically detect what other people are trying to insert into verbs. So oftentimes things get deleted. So you can say, I carried. So after the game is over, for example, if you or particularly the MVP, the player of the game, you can just simply say, I carried, and then you put the period right there, and then now this has transformed, at least in form, into an intransitive verb, because who is a doer of the action? I am the doer of the action. Who carried? I carried. Carried what? And then this is maybe a source of contention. So you can say that there used to be an object here, but in a colloquial environment, it has been deleted because most people understand that if you just simply say, I carried, you are implying probably that the team was the thing that was getting carried. So in this situation, I would still say carried is a transitive verb, but it has been deleted. And unfortunately, when you're doing, because things get deleted in casual speak, when you do formal speak, as in you're taking a standardized test, or you're reading court documents, or you're reading the terms of service, or you're arguing in court about your situation, about how you shouldn't be fined. Unfortunately, it's very grammatical. And if you don't follow the grammar rules, you can easily get screwed. And this is not from experience, by the way, maybe. But more on that maybe another time. So what I'm trying to say is words are complicated. So let's look at an example of an intransitive verb that could also be transitive in other situations. And for example, you could say I walked. So in this situation, walked, what type of form am I proposing it is? I'm saying right here it is an intransitive verb. So all we need to do is have an argument fulfilled in the front, and it is a complete sentence. And when people read this, they understand that there is someone who did something. Who is that someone? That person is I. What did I do? I walked. Do I need to walk a thing? Well, technically I walked myself, right? But you wouldn't write that because that's kind of strange. Because why is that strange? That is kind of strange. So when you say I walked myself, that is very strange because typically if we are trying to use walked as a transitive verb, typically it's used with pets. So for example, you could say I walked the dog. So in this situation, there's a separate entity, and this is also a separate entity. So argument number one is entity A, and then the argument number two is a different entity. So they're different nouns. So noun A is not equivalent, is not the same thing as noun B. So in most contexts, people would use walked in that particular fashion. So if you say I walked, it's a strange construction because the implication, at least from my perspective, is A is a separate entity from B, and that is very strange. So nobody really says I walked myself. Well, I guess you could say I walked myself to the car. So maybe if you've been injured and you are recovering, well, you've been injured for a long time, for example, you were you were unable to walk for a certain amount of time. So you were unable to walk, but then as time went on, if you're lucky, you were able, and then you maybe got some physical therapy, you were able to walk yourself. So I walked myself to my car. for example. I guess in this case, that would not be an awkward construction. So all of this is just to illustrate how something like walked, at first, it might seem like solely an intransitive verb, but it could easily be transformed depending on the context, depending on the situation you're trying to express, you, the author, or some author is trying to express something. So, depending on the intent of the writer, it could be intransitive or transitive. And I hope that makes sense. Let's go over a few more examples. You can say, I ran. And the situation is a very basic sentence construction. The verb I'm using here is of the form intransitive because I am explicitly putting something in the front and I'm not putting anything behind it because nothing is being run. I am actively doing an action. Although you could technically argue I ran myself. Maybe, maybe not. But I would say for now this is intransitive. And then of course you could say I ran today. This is not the main focus of what I want to talk about, but it might be, this construction might fool some people into thinking that this is the way it's being used today. The way it's being used right here, some people might interpret it as a transitive verb, right? I ran today. But this is simply a temporal modification to your sentence telling you when something happened. This is not a thing that is being run. That's the contrast with something like I ran my program. So if you're a programmer, you can say something like this. I ran my program. So in this situation, there is a doer of the verb action. So someone ran something. Who did it? I did it. What was being run? My program was being run. So in this situation, there is a transfer of action. So there is the subject doing something. The verb is happening. So the subject is executing the verb. What was verbed? It was the program. It's the object of the verb. So this is a transitive situation. So that's transitive. But why is this not a transitive situation? Again, this is a timing situation. This is a timing modifier. I think this is referred to as an adverb. It modifies when the action occurred, but this is not the focus. In other words, the today is not the thing being run. I am doing the running because I'm the author. I'm telling you exactly what this sentence is supposed to say. So I know what I mean, and I'm trying to express that I did the action, and today is not a thing that I ran. But in this situation, as the sole authority of the person who had written the sentence, I am the person who did an action. I ran a thing. The thing was the program. This is equivalent to this one. And I really hope that makes sense. Alright. But there is in fact an argument that you can put forth for this one though. I ran today. So if you are not the author, and the author is not there to express the intent behind the sentence, you can actually interpret this as a transitive verb. So for example, if you are running an event, like maybe you're running a track meet, you're running a donation drive, you can say that I ran a drive, or there's an event today and you ran that event. So the today is the event. I ran today. Yesterday my friend ran. My friend ran yesterday. Yesterday was the event. You understand what I'm saying? Unfortunately, there's no feedback, so speaking to the void yet again. But for the most part, people would not say today. If they're trying to use this ran as a transitive verb, they would say I ran the event, which would make more sense to most people. Alright, so I'm just trying to establish certain rules. If you have a certain type of verb, then you have to have argument fulfillments. And that's the key to understanding something called subject-verb agreement. And in fact, this agreement is a very prevalent rule in the English language. For the most part, in my opinion, I think it has to do with musicality of language. And I wish I actually knew some linguists so they can confirm this. Or they could maybe say, hey, that seems kind of reasonable. I don't know. All of this stuff I'm just making up. So be aware of that. So don't cite me as an authority. I'm definitely not an authority. What do I know? What do I know? But here is a situation. You could say he paints as a sentence. And in this situation, paints is used as an intransitive verb, but it can also be used as a transitive verb because you can paint a picture, right? Or if you just say he paints, you're basically saying this is an occupational type of situation. For a living, so he paints for a living as an example, but you don't need for a living, and more on that a little later. Like I said, as long as you fulfill the basic requirements, I would consider this to be a complete sentence. You just follow. If you are using this as an intransitive verb, then all you need to have one argument, and the rest of this is just following some minor rules to make it conventionally correct. So he paints, right? That is a complete sentence. So this, he is presumably singular. So as a single count, he, and then we have the paints, and then this is what the S on the back, that is the singular form for a verb. So this is called a singular verb. And that might sound kind of ridiculous to people who haven't grown up with the language. So why is people learn this basic rule, right? If you add an S to something, it becomes plural. So if you say turtle, without an S, you are saying one turtle. There's a singular turtle. I promise I draw better than this, but this is just illustrative purposes. So you could say there is a single turtle. But when there are more than that, you have to, by English grammar rules, you have to put an S. So turtles, right? You add the S to signify multiple instances of that noun. But the same is not true for the verb, though. If you put an S on the verb, it's opposite, which might seem very counterintuitive, but here's how I reason it. So let's use the word turtle as the subject. So that is the noun. Here's a turtle, and then there's going to be a verb we're going to use for that. I'm going to pick an intransitive verb, swim. So when you put these two together, turtle, swim, it is complete as an idea because the verb swim is intransitive in this situation, and you have an argument for that one. So this is a complete sentence. But unfortunately, it doesn't follow typical rules. You need to put swims right here. And I'm trying to get to why you have to put an S right there. So understand this one needs an S. But why does it need an S? And here's my suspicion. And I wish there was an actual linguist or historian to confirm this. If you put turtles, and the rule is to always add S to plural to make things a plural. If you put swims here, because you want consistency, if you're making the English language and you're making up the rules and you want consistency and you feel this is consistent, it's actually difficult to pronounce. So turtles, swims, you have to end with this double Z-ish sound, which is, I wouldn't say a tongue twister, but it definitely causes issues with tongue muscle movement. And again, I wish a linguist was here to back me up on this, but I believe that because of the musicality of language, turtles, swims, that double S sound is disgusting or hard to say. So people ended up not putting this S. So turtles, swim is much easier, at least in my opinion, to verbalize. On text, it doesn't matter. But when you're verbalizing things, it matters because probably speech evolved auditorily and not like written first. So written language probably came after spoken language. I don't think anyone really contests that idea. But again, that's my idea. So if you don't have the S, then you have the S. If you have the S, then you don't have the S. Again, this is just the musicality of English language. You're going to learn that's true for other languages as well, not just English. So for example, if you're learning Spanish for the first time, there's something called feminine nouns and masculine nouns, and then you learn there's something like articles. So for example, you're talking about water. Water is agua. It ends in an A, so by the word form, this is considered quote-unquote feminine. So it would typically require a feminine article, la, so la agua, but that sounds kind of funky because of this la, which is a rising vowel sound, and then agua, because it sounds kind of awkward, which I would agree with. People change this to el agua. So el not ending in the vowel sound, and this one ending in the vowel sound. So that's an example of another musicality in a different language. So that's what I think happened. And that's why we have this seemingly conflict, but it actually isn't conflict from a musical perspective. So turtle swims, and then turtles swim sounds a lot better than turtles swims. And I mentioned this because this is how some types of problems are written to exploit the fact that musicality is what people are accustomed to, and when things don't sound musically correct, it sounds incorrect. But written language doesn't care about musicality for the most part. Well, I guess after the musicality established the rules, if you're arguing from that perspective, then yes. Alright, so let's go over another example. So the cat eat food. Very basic sentence construction. We have a verb. It's a transitive verb. There is a doer of the verb, and then there is a recipient of the verb. So this is this SVO construction, subject, verb, object. This is, again, it's a transitive verb. There is a transfer of action. The food is being consumed. There's action being performed on the food. So the food is the object of the action, and then the subject is the thing that we're talking about, that we're focusing our mental image of. It's the cat. It's the doer of the action. So is the sentence construction correct? Well, at least it's complete, because for a transitive verb, you just need something in the front, and then you need something in the back. Well, technically, if you just put cat eat food, this is a complete idea. If you say this sentence, most people will understand what you're saying, but they will know that you have not grown up with the language. So what is the correct formation of the sentence? You need to put S here. This is a singular cat as an idea. There's no S here. So musicality-wise, you have to put an S. You don't put cats eats, because again, that's difficult to pronounce. Cats eats food is kind of a tongue stumbler. So cat eats food. This is also non-native language speak. You'd have to put the article the, signifying there's a cat that you have in your mental image, and you're pointing to that specific cat. So that's why we have something called an article. I think this is an article or an adjective. I don't remember. But this is basically modifying the word cat. It's telling you which cat. It's the cat. It's not a cat. It's not cats in general. It's a specific cat that I have in my mind's eye, or maybe I'm pointing to it directly across the room, for example. So the cat eats food. All right, so that's a basic sentence construction, but sentences can obviously become more complicated, right? And this is how you can make things more complicated. You can make your sentence more complicated by clarifying or adding extra information on parts of your sentences. So maybe the cat is not very specific, and you wish to say something more about this cat. The cat with the brown stripes, right? With the stripes. So the mental image of the cat is a lot more specific now. So now here's the sentence. The cat with the stripes eat food. And you could kind of see, if you missed my sleight of hand, I actually changed something, right? What did I change? I changed this thing right here. And this sentence is complete, but it is incorrect because it violates one of the cardinal rules of silly-ass English. That's, again, SAE, Standard American English. That sentence here violates one of the number agreement rules in SAE, and that violation occurs right here. It's supposed to be eats. But what did I tell you, right? Stripes eats sounds very awkward, so when you actually read the sentence with stripes eats out loud, it is a tongue stumbler. So musically, this sounds correct, right? Like this sounds like a verb. It sounds like multiple stripes. This sounds like singular eat, so shouldn't this be correct? And then the answer is no, because we're not talking about stripes. Stripes. That's not the thing performing the action. Stripes don't eat food. What is stripes doing in the sentence? It's part of an extra tag that clarifies what cat is. So if you think about this, this is like if you clicked on cat, if cat is like a link on the internet and you clicked on it, it'll give you, oh, with the stripes. So this is additional information for the cat. You will learn later, or right now, that this is called a prepositional statement. You carry it to the noun, and this is actually a tagline for the word cat. Ultimately, what we're talking about is the cat. The stripes is not what we're talking about. So subject, and then verb, and then object. This is just filler for the sentence from a certain point of view. So when you're doing number agreement, subject verb number agreement for SAE, then this one must agree numerically with this one. So if you put an S here, that's the right one for a singular subject. Okay? So again, this is the trick of musicality, and some standardized tests will exploit this. They understand that people associate plurality, and they sometimes get it mixed up with the verb, and they might improperly make the formation of this word. So here is an example of a generic grammar test question, especially for some silly-ass test, okay? What word best goes in the underlined space? And then they might have option A is eat, and then option B is eats, and then option C is eating, option D is to eat. And these are basically, this is a unconjugated, this is a unmodified verb. So this one will never be placed right here for the subject. You don't say the cat to eat food. That's non-conventional. Which again sounds like I'm arguing from authority. It kind of is, right? This is common usage. This is not used as a verb. This is typically used as a noun. So the answer is not D. So then C is eating. It doesn't have a thing in the front, so this is not a verb, eating, as it is in this form. Is something called a noun, a gerund noun. But more on that another time. This is not the answer. So don't worry about why these two are wrong at the moment, if you're concerned. So the answer, the choice is really between either option A or option B. And again, most, well, I should stop saying most people, but some people who fall for the musical trap would put eats, well, would not put eats, because again, stripes sounds plural, and then the adjacentness, because people are used to subject-verb-object type constructions, it feels that this is the subject musicality-wise. People might realize that the subject is actually cat, but they might misconstrue the musicality with the rule change. So this one, they might think there's no S, but That is unfortunately not the answer. This is the answer. So the cat eats the food, not the stripes. So if you're good at mentally omitting parts of a sentence, you can omit the adjectival parts of the sentence. So this is just extra filler. You can imagine that this is like hypertext or something. If you hover over the cat image, then you get this additional information, but you don't, quote unquote, need this information. So the cat, singular, no S, eats, with an S, food. That's the musicality that you want. That's the musical agreement that you want, not with the stripes. Okay. Let's do another one. So we have the sack of potatoes. The sack of potatoes was left in the sun, or was left in the truck. So this is a complicated sentence. I didn't exactly go over too much in terms of how to construct a more complicated sentence. But let's try to identify what's being talked about. Well, always try to focus on the verb as a whole, okay? So the verb, again, I think it's the most important part of a sentence. Here's a verb. It's some sort of linking verb, so we have was. So something is supposed to be equal to something else. Again, this could be some sort of noun. This could be some sort of noun, in which case the sentence is saying A is the same thing as B. Or this could be some sort of quality. So the A has the quality of Q. That's the linking verb. This is the is type equality statement linking verb. So we have was. What was? So we have the sack of potatoes was. So that's thing number one, sack of potatoes. We'll just call that A for brevity's sake. So A was what? Left in the truck. So that is going to be B. So in this situation, this is not a noun. Left in the truck is some sort of quality thing. It's the describing. It's a descriptive of the noun in A. So was the sack of potatoes rotting? No, the sack of potatoes was not rotting. Was the sack of potatoes burnt? No, the sack of potatoes was not burnt. The sack of potatoes was left in the truck. So this is simply adjectival in its function. So this is not a noun, even though it has a noun. But again, don't worry about this. In fact, this is just a prepositional modifier that's describing left. The sack of potatoes was left. All right. So this is the sentence that we're talking about, but if there was a grammar problem, for example, the question might read, the sack of potatoes is is, you know what? No, let me change this. I'm sorry. Was, were. All right, so this is the sentence, and this is going to be the underlined portion. And the question asks, is the underlined word correct in the correct form? A sack of potatoes were left in the truck. With a quick reading, it sounds musically correct because you have S-type word adjacent to this verb type, which doesn't have an S, so it feels correct musicality-wise. But unfortunately, this is not correct. Because actually, we're not talking about potatoes. That's not our subject, unfortunately. The subject is the sack. What is potatoes doing in the sentence? Even though this is a noun, unfortunately, it is adjacent. It follows from left to right from this thing called a preposition. The preposition is carried to the noun. So this is actually a modifier. This is an adjective to describe something. Again, you can imagine there's an image. Here's the image. And then if you hover your mouse over it, then there's like some little explanatory text. And this is the explanatory text that tells you more about what type of sack that is. So for analysis sake, you can actually omit this mentally. And now the error of the sentence reveals itself. The sack were left? How many? It's a singular sack. So no S on the back, so this one will require an S. So the sack was. Again, sacks was sounds musically atrocious, so they don't both have S's. So this is a singular, no S, and then this is the verb corresponding with the S, so musicality, everything works out. The number agreement works out. So this is correct. The sack was left. Bonus information, this is a prepositional word. It describes relative placement of nouns in the truck. Again, you start with the prepositional word and then you carry it all the way to the noun. This is just an adjectival word modifier clause thing, so you will mentally omit it. So your basic sentence runs as subject, verb, adjective. So this is the subject. This is a linking verb. Linking verbs can have subjects or they can have adjectivals. So left is an adjective. So that is the complete sentence construction, and you want to make sure this one, if it has an S, then this one doesn't have an S. If this one has an S, then this one does not have an S. Isn't that wonderful? All right, let's do some more of these ones. Unfortunately, I can't really type in this drawing program. It's a very poor configuration for text boxes, unfortunately. Even MS Paint has a better text box option. Look what happens. Here's a text box thing. You don't see the window, but once I type something, hit enter, where did it go? It's just always centered in the middle of the drawing program, and this is very obnoxious. So unfortunately, I can't type my sentences. I have to literally write it out until I discover how to do it properly. Even if I could type it out, I'm a very slow typer. Okay, so here we go. The house across the street. The house says across the street. This is the conundrum. Well, not conundrum. This is the issue of making up word problems. You really have to think about the rules. Because in order to explicitly ding someone for being incorrect, you have to point to very specific rules about why it is incorrect. But unfortunately, there are other types of number agreements in a sentence besides subject verb. So let me think about this. The house is across the street. You could already tell this is wrong because this S here and S there, right? But you can see musically I'm trying to trick people by putting the S and no S right here. So some unfortunate souls might hear this musically as correct, but it is incorrect. But let me finish the sentence. The houses across the street has have been considered for demolition. That sounds weird. So here's the sentence. The houses across the street has been considered for demolition, and I put past tense ed because that circumvents having to distinguish between plurality because considered works for plural things and singular things. So as a problem designer, that's why I put this ED situation. Alright, so the houses across the street has been considered for demolition. So again, the musicality trick is to have this with no S, so it sounds like it agrees with this S, but that's actually not what we're talking about. So first, you got to identify the verb. The verb has been. Some would argue considered, but I would say considered is not a verb in this situation. So has been will be the verb. Let me write that down. And this is a linking verb because it's has is actually, is it a linking verb or is it a different type of verb? Because has is at its base form is have, and you can have things, right? Like I have 3 figures, for example. There's the doer of the action, that's I, and then there is the action itself, which is possessing have, and then there are things being had, which would be the figures. So there are 3 figures that are being have. So that one would be a transitive verb, but in this situation, is it transitive? Are the houses having a thing called considered? I would say no. So this has been, as a verb form, is a linking because we have a sort of an equality statement. Houses equals considered, right? So we have houses equals considered. So considered is describing, it's a statement of quality of the houses. So we have subject, we have verb. This is not an object because these are not the things being possessed. So again, I would argue that considered is an adjective in this situation. So subject, verb, adjective. So do we have an agreement in terms of musicality? Houses has bad music sounding, so this is incorrect. It's not has, it's have. Doesn't matter that street is singular because that's not what we're talking about. What is across the street? It's the houses are across the street. So this is just extra textual information. We don't technically need it for the full sentence construction. Because remember, if you think about verbs as functions, this verb is linking. It only needs thing to the left and thing to the right, and it's complete. Any extra thing is fluff. Anything else is just fluff, in my opinion. So the houses have been considered for demolition, and this is a correct sentence structure. Following number agreement form as well. So we are good to go. And I think that's all I want to do for today. Maybe I'll do a follow-up stream another day to go over many more sentences, because otherwise I'll be sitting here thinking like, what's the next sentence I could come up with? And I'd rather not to do that. So I would rather pre-write the sentences, have them on the side so I can reference them, and I'll just whip them out and I'll start writing them on this board. So yeah, I think that's going to be the plan. And maybe talk more about adjectival parts of a sentence. How do you strip down a sentence from a very complicated sentence into a simpler sentence so you can identify subject verb or subject verb object or subject verb adjective or adjective verb subject. So it's pretty fun in my opinion. I actually like grammar. Except when I was learning it, of course. When I was learning it for school, that was definitely... No, actually, I would say it was actually okay in school too. Like when I was learning it back in the days in high school, it was actually okay. I never liked diagramming sentences. Well, that was annoying. Diagramming sentences. That was a particular exercise in which you would break down a sentence and you would put them on a sentence map. Let me just show you what that is. By the way, if you are no longer interested, you know, this is just extra information. So let's go back to the sack of potatoes, right? Sack of potatoes. Again, we know that the topic the subject is the sack, and then of the potatoes is simply an adjective to describe the sack. So the sack of potatoes was in the truck. Was in the back of the truck. I'll change the sentence. So we have multiple prepositional phrases modifying this, and then we have back of what? Of the truck. Also modification. So when you're talking about something like this, at least by old school conventions, there's like subject predicate. Again, I never really liked that. So the subject is sack. That is the thing being talked about, the subject, and then we have, I didn't write it completely. It was in the back of the truck. So sack, what about the sack? It was what? Descriptive, in the back of the truck. So by most traditional grammar breakdown, this would be called the subject, and then this would be called the predicate. It's the completion of the idea. Sack was in the back. That rhymes. Sack was in the back. So that's the complete sentence. So what is the doing? I think people put it right here. I haven't done these in forever. But basically this one is a descriptor for sack. And also of potatoes is a descriptor for the sack. So you put a second tagline here. So this is like your message, and then these are like the taglines, right? So the is describing the sack, and then of potatoes is describing sack as well. So this will be like the hashtags. Sack, hashtags the, hashtags of potatoes. So that is how you diagram the, I think maybe I messed this up. I don't know. Again, it's been ages since I've done this. I always felt these exercises were better if you actually have a good foundation to begin with. But to learn this foundation in the first place, I felt it was never a good idea. Okay, in the back of the truck. So back of what? It's in the back of the truck. I think maybe you do it like this. Of what? The truck. Or maybe you do it like this. I don't remember anymore. Something like that. Anyway, this is diagramming sentences. Some people still do it. Some teachers who teach English, wherever they are in the world, might still do sentence diagramming. It's to try to get students to understand the core components of a particular sentence. Again, it's contingent upon, it's on the foundation that people are learning the traditional grammar construction. The way to express grammar construction is subject, verb, predicate, or subject, predicate. I don't like that approach. No, I prefer to think about verbs as functions, because maybe I have my math biases. But that's just talking, that's just rambling at this point. Let us call it for today. Thank you for being here, wherever you may be. And I'll hopefully see you another time. Signing off.